Hey, this is Rob, and in this recording, what I'm going to do is walk everybody through our lecture that's the Introduction to CSS. You'll also get this PDF given to you as part of your class files, and hopefully we can go through and do this and not have to mess around with the time in class for doing it. So what is CSS? CSS is a acronym that stands for Cascading Style Sheets. CSS style sheets are what we use to style HTML web pages. When HTML was first built, it was intended to be a document retrieval system for the most part, and then people realized, of course, that you can use it for many much more complicated things like sharing pictures of cats on the internet. But HTML didn't really have any design tools built into it, and some of the design tools that were built into HTML make HTML a little bit problematic to use. Instead of, for example, going through and putting a B tag or an I tag or style sheets that are inside of a document itself, external style sheets will save you a whole lot of work and a whole lot of trouble as you're learning how to make web pages look awesome. External style sheets are saved as CSS files. So just like you recall that HTML files have an extension of .html, so do CSS files have an extension which is .css. So in your web folder, you'll most likely have one, or as your projects progress, many HTML pages, and you'll also have one or possibly more CSS files saved with an extension of .css. So how does CSS work? The syntax is pretty straightforward. The CSS rules have two main parts. There's a selector and one or more declarations. The selector is written on one line, and then the declarations, of which there can be many, are wrapped up after that in angle brackets or mustache brackets, some people call them. They're the little brackets that you have to hit the shift key for above your enter or your return key. So for example, we'll take a look at this. This is a selector, which is the H1 element on a page. We have those angle brackets on a line down from it, and then a couple lines down further that say that this is everything that's related to that one declaration. And then within that, those declarations there are stacked on top of one another vertically. So again, the selector is the H1, and the declarations are color blue and text align center. And when I'm doing this lecture live, this is normally where I ask people what they think this would do to a page, and the answer is that it would take every H1 element on the page, because the selector is for an H1 element, any H1 element on the page, and the declarations would tell the browser to turn the H1 blue and text align it to the center. Pretty straightforward. You'll also notice here that behind each of these declarations is a semicolon. This is kind of the best practice to be able to write these things. The declaration will have a colon, and then it will end with a semicolon here. In theory, you don't have to end your last declaration with a semicolon, but in practice, if you do that, you will almost inevitably wind up writing some more stuff under here that won't work because the style sheet won't recognize this as its own declaration. The property and the values are the two things that are within a declaration. The property is the style attribute that you want to change, and there's a limited number of properties in CSS. Even with CSS3 and Grid and Flexbox, there's still a limited number of these. The values are more or less arbitrary, more or less infinite, because you can come up with any color that you want to, or there's any number of values that are matched with certain declarations, and some are arbitrary and some are not. You'll learn all this later on. The declaration always ends with a semicolon, and then the declarations are surrounded by curly brackets. And so again, if we have our H1 example, this is exactly the same code that you see here and that you see here. This is just a little bit easier for people to read. You'll sometimes see examples like this. This is much easier for people to read, and it's more or less how I'm going to write it in class and how you'll get used to writing these things in class. So again, for our H1, the selector is the H1. The declarations are color :blue and text align :center. And then the property and value pairs, the property is color, and then the value of that color is blue. Obviously, the value of this might be different. If you wanted the H1 to be red, you would type in red, or if you wanted it to be taupe, you might type in a hex color here. And then the text align property just has left, right, and center values. So in this case, we're going to use the center value to text align it to the center. Pretty easy. And that whole block is the color blue text align center block that we have here. Okay, moving on. There's also things inside of style sheets that are called comments. And what comments do is that they serve two functions. They're just like comments in HTML. So they can be used to explain your code or break it up into certain parts. You might have comments in a really long style sheet that say, typography styles go here, and cut line styles are a subset of that. And then over in another section, you might have all of your styles for images or mugshots or what have you. So that can organize and explain your code. And then you can also use comments to activate and deactivate portions of your code. So if you're trying to see if something isn't working, you might just turn it off with a comment. You might just comment around it so you don't have to, blow out 100 lines of code and then retype them later, and save and refresh and see what's going on in the browser. And comments are ignored by the browser if you're using the right syntax. They won't show up in the HTML page. So the CSS comment syntax looks like this: the slash and asterisk, followed by the comment, followed by the asterisk and slash. So if I wanted to try my paragraph text aligned to the center, and I wanted to test that out and see what it looked like if I didn't have that comment or that command there, I could just write the little comment syntax around it and it would disappear from my page. Okay, third part: external, internal, and inline styles. An external style sheet is pretty much the best practice for writing large chunks of style code because it can apply to styles for a series of pages in your site. So a single change that you make to that file will change all of your pages. It's pretty easy and not time consuming to be able to do CSS that way. Internal styles are something that you can use to style a single page. Let's imagine a site where you've got 12 pages that are all styled the same, and then one page that has, maybe it's the front page of your site, and it has just a few different style tweaks in it. That might be a reason that you would use internal styles, where you just want to change a few things to that page, and that the rest of the site needs to be able to work the same. So we do that within the head tag, and we use the style tag. And then inline styles is kind of the clunkiest way to write CSS. You don't want to write inline styles for things that you can change in batches with internal or external style sheets. But you can use that to style one occurrence of an element. Maybe on that home page that we're hypothesizing about, you have one H1 that needs to be different from all the other H1s in your site. Go ahead and pop in an inline style right there just for that one thing, but you'll just have to remember to change that individually if you want to change it later on. So how do we get style sheets linked up with our pages? With XHTML, which is the version of HTML that we start with, we put this within the head tag. And if you recall from your HTML lectures, there's only one head tag on a page. And within the head, we use a link. And then because it's XHTML, we have to tell the HTML the relationship, which is a style sheet, the type, which is a text CSS style sheet, and then finally we get to add the href tag that gives us the anchor to that, and it's stylesheet.css in this case. Here, this would work for a style sheet that's inside of the web folder that I'm using at the same level that I'm using. Otherwise, your regular link styles apply. So if this is inside a folder called styles, you would write href equals styles/stylesheet.css, or whatever your particular implementation is. That's going to vary a little bit. So multiple styles cascade into one style. That's why we call them cascading style sheets. And so you can specify these styles in three different ways. One is inside of the HTML element, which is the inline style. The second is in the head element of an HTML page. That's the internal style. And then you can also specify it in an external CSS file, which is your external style sheet that we talked about just a second ago. So the inside an HTML element and the head element in an external CSS file. And you can also reference multiple style sheets within a single HTML document. When we talk about Google Fonts later on and getting fonts on your pages, we will absolutely reference those multiple style sheets that way. It can be a little bit confusing, but once you've got the basics of it down, it'll be a snap for you. So here's how these styles cascade into a new set of styles. The first rule is that styles apply by whatever the browser default is. So as we saw when we were doing HTML, if we have an HTML page where we have, say, an H1 on it, that H1 is going to be larger than the other type that's on the page. If we have a link element inside of a page and it hasn't been followed, it will have a blue underline. If it's been followed, it'll have a purple underline. Those are the browser default styles. The second thing that overrides those is that anything in an external style sheet will override the browser defaults. And then anything that's in an external style sheet will be overridden by an internal style sheet, which is the thing that we have in the head element. And then finally, the most specific style we can get is the inline style that's inside of the HTML element. So that's the order of inheritance that these things will work. And if you think about this a little bit, this seems to make some sense. The browser default is just what's going to happen if you don't have a style defined. And then the external style sheet you might use to style your entire site. And then you might have a page where you need to style just a few things differently. So you stick an internal style sheet in the head element. And then maybe on that page, there's just like one thing that's not like anything else anywhere in your site. So you use an inline style and that will override that. When we talk about the browser developer tools, we'll show you some ways to look at what styles are being applied where. And that can be really useful for debugging your CSS. Why is this showing up this way? Oh, I forgot that I had this style applied in this particular way. So inline style overrides the head element, overrides the external sheet, overrides the browser default. And then finally, how do we tell the browser what to apply where? You can apply tag, class, and ID selectors to parts of your document to apply CSS. So a tag selector will apply to an HTML tag, like a paragraph tag that's being shown here. This will apply to every paragraph in the page that it's referencing unless you tell it to do something different. A class selector will apply to an item that's been given a class, and you would apply a class over here in your HTML by typing the word class equals, and then you would give that class name an attribute value pair. The attribute is here, the value is here. So the value might be first. And why would I do this? I might want to just create, for example, a set of paragraphs on my page that's the first paragraph of each blog post where maybe the text is a little bit bigger and more spaced out and has some more letter spacing or line spacing. You know, I might create a class of first paragraphs to do that with. And then finally, the ID selector applies to an item that's been given an ID. And so the same idea, you have an ID equals, and then you give it an attribute. And an ID attribute is meant to style one instance of an element. You shouldn't use multiple ID attributes on the same page. You can use discrete or different ID attributes, but you don't want to use the same ID attribute more than once because the whole point of an ID is that it applies to one person. The analogy that I always use is think about your personal photo ID, that is yours, but you're also in a class, we can say in a grouping of students in this class. So we might apply the same attendance rules to every single one of you, but each of you might get a different grade. That might be thought of as your class, class structure versus your ID structure. So the syntax looks like this because for each of these things in the HTML, we specify how it works over in the CSS a little bit differently. So for the tag selector, if we just have a tag selector of P and we're going to do this to all the paragraph tags, then the CSS selector is just that naked tag here, so just the P itself, and then we have our declaration and properties and so on and so forth. For a class, you identify that class over here in the CSS with the paragraph, or the period rather. So a dot first or a period first, that would reference a class of first over here. That's how the CSS knows you're looking for a class. And then for a nav selector like this, we would use the # octothorpe hashtag, whatever you want to call it, to identify that this is an ID. So this is an ID of nav, this is a class of first, and this is going to apply to every paragraph tag on the page. That's it takes a little bit of memorization, but it'll catch on for you pretty quickly. Often when people are writing code early on, they'll confuse or forget one of the class or ID selectors or transpose them, and then their code won't work, and it's a simple fix. A couple of additional notes about this. The tag selectors do apply to all the tags in the document. The class selectors can be used multiple times because the whole point of that is to create a class of similar objects. You know, all of these mugshot and paragraph combinations are going to look the same. All of these cards that I'm building are going to look the same, so they're all in the same class. And the ID selectors may only be used once per page. If you recall back to the XHTML lecture, we also touched briefly on generic HTML tags, which are div and span. And the div and span tags don't have any meaning on their own. They don't affect document style. What we use them for is to wrap content in either a div or a span, so we can generically, we can do things to large pieces of content that way. For example, we might have this HTML, and this shouldn't look too scary after you've seen the XHTML document, but you'll notice I've got a couple of divs here. I've got a main div and a sidebar div. And within those things, what I could do is I could create a CSS selector that might look like this. It might say main, and I would have my rule, and it would only target this part of the body. So it might be that I want to take this main div and, you know, move it to the left side of the page and let it lay out vertically like a blog post style of things. And I want to do something different with the sidebar over here. So if I had this selector, the sidebar selector, then that would target only this part of the HTML over here. So you can see there that I would be able to use those couple of IDs coupled with the div tag to be able to treat two pieces of my content separately, maybe to, again, left justify and right justify something on a page or what have you. And then that CSS selector would actually target only a part of the HTML. So this is a, you'll notice this is a class selector. We can tell because there's a dot here, or by looking down here and it's given a class down here. And the span is like a div, but an inline element. A div is a block level element, a span is an inline element. And then that way I might just say the first 3 or 4 words of every paragraph I'm going to make bold so people have a nice little lead into them or something like that. That would target just that part of the HTML. So I can write multiple style rules for different parts of the HTML by using these div and these span tags to break it out a little bit differently from other pieces of the HTML. Okay, defining colors in CSS. last little bit of this. There's a bunch of keyword colors, and the keywords for colors are just kind of like the basic colors that you would have learned in elementary school, you know, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, that sort of thing. Will help you define colors that way. We can also define colors by hex code, which is this pound sign and then a value that's alphanumeric that goes from F to 0 on the other side, or 0 to F if you want to count up that way. You can find lists of hex colors all over the web, or you can also find hex color values for things over in a program like Photoshop or free alternatives to Photoshop, GIMP, and whatnot. There's a short hex code, which if I have the CC3300, I can shorten that down to C30. And then there's also RGB color names, which are becoming probably more popular than hex at this point because people are working a bit more with RGB for various reasons. So that's a red, green, and blue value, color value, that spans from 0 for no color or black all the way up to 255 for white, and all the nuances that are kind of in between those in the red, green, blue color family. And then we can also use RGB percentages, and there's a full list of CSS color names that are included in your guys' links in the resources page of the GitHub site. We can also style links in CSS. We're going to look at how we do this here in just a minute, but there's 4 basic states that links are styled in. There's the basic, these are called pseudo classes, by the way, anything that follows a declaration with a colon like this as the selector. So the link style is a standard unvisited link. The visited link is a link that the user has visited, pretty straightforward. The hover state is what happens when a link is being hovered over. This is still used sometimes. It's a nice backup for desktop, but you should not rely on this to let people know where there's a link because there's no hover state on mobile, and we know that mobile is where most people are viewing the web. And then finally, the active state is what happens to the link when the user clicks on it. Maybe you want it to flash a different color slightly or do something like that to let the user know that it's been tapped on. This is useful for mobile because when you tap the link, it might change its appearance just slightly to tell you that it's actually linked. You have to style it like this. Hover has to come after a link and visited. If you're using active, active must come after the hover value. So basically just write what you see up top there, and that will be the easiest way to make sure that your link styles are going to work. And then finally, the last page here is the CSS box model. We're going to come back to this in another couple of videos, but the essential thing for you to know in about 30 seconds is CSS treats everything like a box. We can fake rounded edges with tools like border radius and things like that, but CSS essentially treats content like it's in a box. The content is whatever is in the inside here. Around the content we can add padding, and padding will take on whatever background color we would give to the content itself. Around padding we can have a border, which is usually a solid border, otherwise why would you use one, but you can have a border around the padding. And then finally margin is used to push elements away from one another. So border, padding, and content can all have colors associated with them. Margin does not. Margin will just show the background color of the page. So you'll see people sometimes try to add color to an element and then add margin to it and don't understand why it doesn't go all the way out to the edge, and that's because margin doesn't actually have a color. Okay, that's going to be it for the CSS lecture. Hopefully you learned a little bit in 18 or so minutes, and next we're going to look at reading some CSS style sheets. We want to be able to read our CSS before we write it so we can be predictable about what's going to happen there.